Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Educatedcollins Snap channel. How you doing? So today we're going to be covering retreating. A lot of people have been asking me for a retreat guide, and I've come and made one. This is kind of going to be covering all aspects of retreating, what you should be thinking about, what retreating actually is, and when and why you should be retreating. So let's get right into it. So overall, nice little image, just kind of images of retreating. But basically, what is retreating? Retreating, or when should you retreat? Retreating is when you can easily imagine a scenario where you lose. That's it. If you can imagine a scenario when you lose, you leave. It's that simple, that easy. You don't have to make it complicated for yourself. Basically, I mean, anything else doesn't really matter. It's just like if you can lose, if you can easily imagine a loss scenario, you can leave, especially against good players. Now, usually what people kind of tell you is, oh, if you should stay in if you have a 50% chance to win or like a 30% chance to win, blah 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 blah. They'll tell you to stay. Percentages are bait. Don't listen to percentages. Trust your instincts. Good players are not going to adhere to those percentages, right? If you're staying against like someone like me and you're like, "Oh, I have a 50% chance to win." No, you don't. You don't. You don't have a like I've calculated you've lost here. So, you just have to trust if you think to yourself, "Oh, I'm going to win this," then you should stay in. But if you're like, "Oh, I'm not sure," that's not confident enough to be staying in these type of high pressure games, especially for like 8 cubes. If you're not sure, you shouldn't have put yourself in that position. So don't let the percentages let you stay into games that you're supposed to be leaving. Just trust your instincts, trust your gut. As you get better, you'll have better instincts and you'll be able to make better decisions. All right, so the first step to actually learning how to retreat properly is to understand the meta. If you don't know the meta, if you don't know what you're up against, you don't really have the idea of when you're supposed to be retreating and when you're not supposed to be retreating. If you're playing these games and every time you fight a deck, you're like, I have no idea what this deck does, how are you going to know when you have the advantage and when you don't? So you have to have a good understanding of what your opponents could be playing and also what they're thinking. So it's not enough to know that they're playing a discard deck, right? You have to think, what would they be doing on this turn, especially if they've snapped, right? What are they doing? They're gonna play Modork, or they're gonna play Hella, or they're gonna play Morbius plus whatever, right? Like, you have to know what they could be playing and then what they're thinking about during their plays. If you don't understand that, you probably shouldn't be snapping and you should be focusing on learning the meta. If you don't know the meta, you just don't know the game and you don't know when to snap, when to retreat. You don't really understand anything. So always first step, learn the meta and then start incorporating that knowledge into your decision making. So how do you beat an opponent's strategy, right? Like, whenever you have a deck build like they're playing Thanos, how do you beat Thanos? I bet you're gonna say, I don't know how you beat Thanos. Like, what are Thanos counters, right? But there are Thanos decks don't win 100% of the time, right? Like, no deck wins 100% of the time. What happens when they lose, right? If you're watching a streamer and they're playing Thanos, what happens to them when they lose? Is it just RNG? Are their opponents playing specific cards? Are they not drawing specific cards? Are they not playing specific cards? Right? Though there are scenarios you can isolate for any deck that in where if these scenarios happen, they lose. Same thing with your deck, right? What happens? What scenarios happen in your deck where if these things happen, you're likely to lose, right? So you have to know that information for all the decks you're playing against, and you especially have to know that information for especially your decks and all the decks that you run. So if you don't have this knowledge, why are you snapping? Why you still need things to learn. So there's a lot of previous knowledge, previous learning, previous meta that you have to develop before you can really start using that knowledge to in every single game of Snap. So I'm sure like already now there's a lot you need to learn. You need to like stop and be like, okay, what things do I not know? Do I know every deck list? Do I know all the meta compositions? Do I know how every meta composition wants to play? How do I know how every composition loses? How do I know how every meta composition wins? Do I know what locations are good for every meta composition? No, not a lot of people know this, right? But if you want to be as good as possible, if you want to understand why people are snapping, why people are leaving, you need to know all this information, right? So the more of this information you have, the better and the easier the game becomes. The better, easier it is to figure out when to snap. The better, easier it is to figure out when to retreat. So it's a lot, obviously, but people play thousands of games, right? And they slowly get this information. And you can do it deliberately, but you can also do it like just by playing the game and then casually like learning and losing and winning, and then you'll have this information. But a lot of the best players will deliberately learn this quickly in a meta. All right, so another tip: do not play out games assuming that your opponent doesn't have their big plays, right? Like if you're playing against a Patriot deck, you should assume they're going to be playing Patriot Mystique turn 6, or they're going to be playing Ultron turn 6, or Doctor Doom or whatever. You should always assume that they have their answers. You basically only you see 75% of your deck every game. You're only not seeing 3 cards, and if they draw an extra card or anything like that, they're seeing more than that. So most of the time they're going to have all of their combos, all of their big plays in their hand. So you should just assume that they have it. And if you're like, oh, well, he only wins if he draws this one card during the game. If he had it, of course they're going to have it. If they don't have it, they're leaving. So if they're staying in, they have it. So you should always assume that they have it. And then if your opponent knows what you're going to do and is snapping, it's probably a good reason to leave. So this is basically for decks that are telegraphed. Decks that are very obvious in what they want to do. If you're playing that type of deck and they're snapping into that when your deck is very telegraphed, you probably need to leave, right? It's very likely they know exactly what you're going to do and they have the math done correctly, and they're like, well, if they do their best play, I still win. Let me stab, right? So that's kind of why obvious decks are pretty bad, because people can learn it and then understand what your best plays are and then snap into it if they have a better play than you do. So it's also one of the reasons why Daredevil is OP. The pressure of a turn 5 Daredevil, you get to play you play whatever you want, and then your opponent sees exactly what you're going to do, and then they snap. Like, it's so scary because they could have a perfect counter to your scenario, and a lot of times you'll leave into that. So Daredevil is like the obvious example because they literally see what you're doing, but players can imagine, okay, they're going to play this on 5, they're going to play Sarah on 5, and then da-da-da-da on 6, right? So if they know what you're going to do and they're snapping into that, it's probably a good reason to leave. Next round, you should always play around their likely best plays. So this is kind of like a follow-up to they always have their answers. If they have their answers, they're going to be making their best plays. And you should always be thinking, okay, if they do this best play, how much power will they have? Can I beat that? If they do this or this other play that's really good, how much power do they have? Can I beat that? If you can't beat those things, it's time to go. You should always be able to beat their best play if you're staying in. If your plays are good, but their plays is better, who cares if your plays are good, right? Like, even if you can do your combo, but their combo is better, like, it doesn't matter that your combo was good. They still beat you. So you have to always be calculating their plays and then seeing, are your plays good enough or better than theirs? So that's something you always have to do. You're basically playing both sides and seeing, is your side the winning side if you put the best plays on both sides. Now, here are things to consider for retreating. It's a lot, I know, But obviously, your opponent's decks, your opponent's board, your opponent's tech cards, your decks, your board, your tech cards, and your hand, right? Because you have that extra information. The locations, and then the location RNG, right? Danger Room, whatever, Subterranea, all these RNG cards or locations, right? How does that affect your board and your opponent's board state? How long is your opponent taking, right? If they're taking a long time, well, they might not have a good play, or they might be thinking about the best play, right? So based on how long and what state of the board it is, it could mean different things. How awkward are your plays? How awkward are your opponent's plays to make, right? Like, when you're doing your play, you're like, it's weird if I do this, it's weird if I do that, right? Like that might be a reason to like, okay, let's not risk it, let's go. Same thing if you're thinking about what your opponent is doing. Do you think your opponent is thinking, oh, this is awkward for me? And if that is what you think your opponent is thinking, then you can snap and pressure them. Have they already snapped, right? So if they've already snapped, right, they're kind of invested. You might also be on the back foot, right? You might think whether to leave or not based on if they've snapped already. Are they emoting you, right? Like if they're emoting you, well, they probably have a good idea of whether who's winning or not, things like that. Sometimes people emote you to make you stay in, right? To make you angry, make you want to stay in and punish them. And then you get that sweet, like, ooh, I beat you even though you're emoting. But sometimes, they're emoting you because they know you have no chance. So they want you to stay in. So you got to be careful about that. Can you make an unexpected play, right? Do you have a card they wouldn't expect or whatever, right? Did you generate a card or get a card from the locations that really counters them, but you normally wouldn't have this in your deck? That would be really, really a powerful way to play. Same thing from your opponent, right? Has there been any RNG that has been added to the game that makes it awkward or easier for them to counter you? Things like that. Can you subvert expectations, right? So subverting expectations is like most people will do this play, but since most people do this play, you could do a different play that they won't assume, and that play will actually also win, right? So sometimes, right, people you'll have like 12 power to play down, and you could play 12 power on the left lane, right? And that lane is very easy to win. But you could also play 12 power in the middle lane, and they're beating you by 11 power, right? Most people will think, okay, I played the 12 power on the left lane because I'm destroying that one. But you could actually subvert expectations, play all that 12 power in the middle lane, and then beat them by one, and they won't commit into the middle lane because they wouldn't assume that you would actually play into that middle lane. So that's kind of the idea of subverting expectations, right? Going right when they think you're going to go left, that kind of thing. If you could do that, that's a very powerful tool, very powerful skill to have. Does your opponent's plays make sense? Right? So this one's interesting. If you're watching your opponent's plays and you're just thinking, this play doesn't make any sense, right? Maybe they have some idea, some game plan that you've never seen before, right? And that might be something to watch out for. Or they might just be bad, and then you're like, well, this is free cubes, right? So, depending on how it feels, you can decide whether to leave, whether to stay, whether to snap, right? So I'm always like kind of judging my opponents in game and thinking like, are they playing like how I think they should be playing, that kind of thing? And if not, then maybe I'll just snap and see, how they react to it, that kind of thing. Are they playing a deck that's obvious? So are they playing a deck where you're like, I know exactly what they're going to do every single turn because it's a deck I've seen before, very obvious, very telegraphed. They always do this on this. Well, then it's very easy to know exactly what they're going to do, and then you can capitalize on that, or how strong their plays are, and then you can retreat. And then, do you lose to an obvious card, right? Do you lose to an Enchantress? Do you lose to a Rogue? Do you lose to a Killmonger? Do you lose to a Shang-Chi? Do you lose to an Arrow, right? Do you lose to obvious cards, right? If you do, and those cards are normally played in your opponent's deck, well, you got to be careful about that, right? You got to be like, it's not worth the risk, right? I don't want to risk my cubes or my extra cubes to this obvious out that the opponent could easily have, that kind of thing, right? So yeah, there's a lot of things you always should be considering for retreating, but I just kind of wanted to throw it out there, just kind of make you think about, I don't think about all of these things every game, but you should be if you're trying to maximize your odds. So when should you retreat, right? If you can't imagine a scenario where you lose, you should play the game out. So not because you think you're going to win, but because if you do lose, you have this extra um like new reality that you can now start thinking about, right? Like if you're like, oh, I never lose, and then the opponent plays like Omega Red and then destroys you. Well, now you're like, oh, they Omega Red's a card that I don't normally play around. Now it's something I could now start thinking about in my games and see, oh, does Omega Red actually beat me here? Da, 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 da. So anytime you can't imagine a scenario where you lose, it's good to play the game out. Even though you might lose and get some cubes, the knowledge you attain from losing will help you in the long run. So if you can't imagine a scenario where you lose, try to play the game out if it makes sense. Like losing 8 cubes for it is like kind of punishing. So it depends on how much you want to learn versus how much you want to, climb. But normally, if you can't imagine a scenario where you lose, you should play it out, right? Because you're gonna win most of the time. But sometimes you'll get surprised. You'll realize, oh, there's actually way more plays that I could lose to than I've thought. So it's always good to make sure you're taking advantage of those moments where, oh, I don't know what I lose to. Play it out and see, oh, I actually lost to this. Now I can start thinking about this scenario or this situation if it arises where they can punish me. Some things like arrow into the location that destroys cards that move here, right? Like that sometimes catches me off guard. And now Fist Tower, I think it's called. Now I'm always like thinking about Fist Tower, like, oh, turn 6 arrow Fist Tower. Oh, I could lose here. And I can definitely catch my opponents off guard because I know, oh, that could be their out, that kind of thing. Take advantage of your surprise cards, right? So your opponent should not expect surprise cards, right? They should be something that catches them off guard. So don't play assuming they know about this unique card you have in your deck, right? You cannot think, oh, if they know I'm running Kingpin Arrow or not, that doesn't really count. Omega Red's an easy one. Or Juggernaut, right? Oh, if they know I have Juggernaut, it's so easy to beat me. Well, they shouldn't know you have Juggernaut, right? Because it's not a common card, and you should take them by surprise. So don't play or retreat assuming that they have knowledge of the cards that aren't normally seen in the game. Snapping doesn't mean you have to stay in for the rest of the game. So if you snap, that doesn't mean you have to play the rest of the game out, right? So a lot of times I'll snap and then my opponent will snap same turn and I'll leave. And then it's like, why? Well, them snapping is like telling me more information about the game state. And then I can like change my scenario or my how advantage I feel based on that extra information. So just because you've snapped doesn't mean you have to play the full game out, right? You could snap, they snap, leave same turn. You could snap, next turn, things change, you leave. So don't be pressured into staying in because you've already snapped. I see this a lot. I think it's wrong. If things have changed, the situation has changed, you should leave. It's that simple. And then you also don't have to think about retreating until your opponent snaps. So if no one snaps in the game, you can always play the game till turn 6. I'm pretty sure that's my next point, right? So if no one has snapped, you can always play the game out till turn 6. So you don't actually have to start really thinking about retreating before turn 6. You should definitely think about snapping before turn 6, but really only when your opponent has snapped do you realistically have to think about retreating. Just because there's no real extra downside for continuing the game out. So that's something I really only focus on the retreating aspect of the game when my opponent has snapped or right before they're about to snap, essentially. Since this is the case, right? The game will always play out till turn 6 if no one snaps. It's always nice to think about why would my opponent retreat and then snap into that scenario, into those moments to push them out of the game earlier, because things can change. Every draw, things can change. Every turn, every location RNG, things can change. So if you can get the cube quicker, easier, without effort, you should try to lean toward those scenarios. If you haven't hit your big play, be careful about staying in, right? So just because the board state is good, but I don't have like my big usual games 6 play, it's risky to stay in, because a lot of times if your opponent has their big turn 6 play, they're going to stay in, they're going to do it. So if you don't have your big play and you stay in, but you think your board state is good, it a lot of times doesn't matter, because their pop-off play is way better than your normal play that you could do. So sometimes there'll be scenarios where I look favored, but then I don't have a good turn 6 and they're staying in. They don't, it doesn't feel like they're scared. Well, then I just leave, because if they have a good play, well, then I've lost. So if you don't have your big play, your power spike, whatever combo that you do, Wong into hazmat or whatever it is, right? Be careful. It doesn't mean you have to leave, but be careful, right? Can you survive without your big play, right? Do you have other alternatives, that kind of thing? And if you don't, then if they do have their big bombs and whatever, then you can easily lose a game where things were looking much better for you earlier. All right, so any RNG location makes staying in significantly more risky. So things like the peak, things like the hub, things like, I don't know, Subterranea, the ones that give you rocks, Lemuria, right? Any of those locations that really can be very swingy RNG, Sakar, right? If your opponent snaps afterwards, you've got to be very scared. You got to be very scared. You got to be assuming they've gotten good RNG from that situation. So you can take advantage of it as well, but you can also play it safe, right? So let's say the peak happens. You could snap into it even if your hand is bad. If you think, oh, your opponent might have a worse situation than you. So the scary part of taking advantage of it is if your opponent has like Iron Man into the peak and you snap, well, thank you for the 4 Qs, mister, that kind of thing. So you do have to be aware of those scenarios and the risks you're taking, but it's definitely easier to retreat into bad locations, right? And any RNG location, especially if your opponent snaps afterwards. If you get put in a disadvantage early, especially for 1 cube, just go. Like, just leave. There's no reason to stay in bad scenarios. Any disadvantage early is perfectly fine to leave for 1 cube. There's no shame in retreating. There's no shame in retreating. Retreating 3 games to get 1 good game can net you big gains, right? If you lose -1, -1, -1, and then you get a +8, you're +5, right? Or +4, you're still +1, right? So even if you're leaving tons of games, as long as you're taking advantage of those good games, that's really what matters. Your win percentage is very negligible in comparison to your net cube gain. So don't be afraid to leave. If anything goes wrong, you can just leave. If you don't like playing against this particular player and they snap you, like, you can leave. There's no shame in that. You just want to find those good matches, those good moments to capitalize on. That's really what the game's about on a macro level. So just be aware of that, right? Sometimes I'll have people saying, why did I retreat here? I didn't like my situation. Like, that's it. You don't need great reasons. It felt awkward here. Like, I'm leaving. There's no reason why you have to play out every single match, or you have to fight tooth and nail for every single match. If anything's awkward, especially early in the game, just get out of there, move to the next one. Double check your math, right? Double check your math. If both of you guys are staying in, one of you is wrong. Like, one of you is wrong. So if they haven't left and you're just like, why are they staying in? Double check your math. See if you're actually miscalculating things, right? Like, oh, especially with buff cards, right? That's very easy to ignore a buff or neglect the extra power you're putting into other lanes. So just anytime people are staying in, you're playing for a lot of cubes. You don't have to. You have a lot of time, right? You don't have to end turn immediately, and they don't allow you to unend your turn, or things like that. So just use the time you have available. Check your math, double check your math, make sure it's correct, make sure you're actually ahead, because all you have to do is lose by one, or get the tiebreak and lose the tiebreak. So just make sure that the math is correct, that you're actually winning, and then commit or leave if it's wrong. Retreating now versus retreating later. So we've hit the meat of it. This is the last few topics. Retreating now and then retreating later. I would say retreating now is not my preferred retreating style. But if your opponent has snapped this turn, well then they can't retreat anymore. So the only reason you would retreat later is if the opponent has a chance of retreating. But if they've snapped, they can't retreat, then you can just retreat now. However, if your opponent hasn't snapped or if it's turn 6, retreating later is preferred. So you just want to give yourself any extra avenues of getting a tie or getting less cube loss. And if both players retreat later, well then you don't lose any cubes. Now it will still say that you lost or you escaped, but you won't actually lose any net cubes. So most of the time, I personally pretty much always retreat later. But if your opponent has snapped, then it's perfectly fine to retreat now. So overall, that's the comprehensive video on retreating. Definitely a lot to take in, especially learning the meta, learning all of the different outcomes that your opponent can do. That will take a long time if you're really like understanding that concept. But if you really want to figure out like when you should be retreating, that is what you have to be doing. So hopefully you guys learned something. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody.